In a lonely house by the sea, a dying woman holds a terrible secret. Her love for her husband is the only thing that matters, but a hidden truth from the past threatens to destroy everything. This is the story of Mrs. Treverton's final struggle. There are secrets that cling to the shadows, desperate to be told. We drag them into the light. Welcome to Gravevale Echoes. In the farthest, most desolate corner of Cornwall, where the land gives up its fight with the sea and crumbles into jagged cliffs, stands Porthgenna Tower. It is not a place of beauty, but of endurance. For centuries, its gray stone walls have been scoured by salt-laced winds and battered by the relentless fury of the Atlantic. The tower doesn't stand on the coast so much as it clings to it, a grim sentinel staring out at an endless expanse of churning, unforgiving water. To the locals, it was a place of ghosts and grim history, a stone monument to secrets best left buried. And inside its thick, sound-dampening walls, in a grand and gloomy bedchamber on the upper floor, Rosamond Treverton was dying. The room itself was a prison of shadows. Heavy, dark oak furniture loomed like silent, judgmental figures in the dim light. The curtains, made of a deep crimson velvet, were drawn tight, but they could not completely silence the haunting symphony of the storm outside. The low, mournful howl of the wind as it snaked around the turrets was a constant companion, a sound that seemed to worm its way through the very stone of the tower. It was punctuated by the deep, percussive boom of waves crashing against the rocks far below us, sound like a giant, steady heartbeat, counting down the final moments of her life. The air was thick and heavy, smelling of sickness, old wood, and the faint, briny scent of the sea that managed to seep into everything. Mrs. Treverton lay propped against a mountain of pillows, her body a fragile, skeletal frame beneath the heavy blankets. Her breathing was a shallow, laborious rasp, each inhale a struggle, each exhale a sigh of defeat. Her skin, once praised for its fairness, now had the pale, translucent quality of fine porcelain, stretched taut over the sharp angles of her face. A fever burned behind her eyes, but it was a fire that gave no warmth, only a torturous, dry heat. She was a woman fading from the world, a flickering candle flame about to be extinguished by the coming darkness. But while her body had surrendered, her mind was a raging tempest. It was terribly, unervingly alive. While her limbs lay heavy and useless, her thoughts raced with a frantic, desperate energy. They circled one another, colliding and recoiling, all centered on a single, agonizing point. The secret. The dead secret. It was more than a memory. It had become a physical presence in the room with her, a cold and heavy specter that sat at the foot of her bed, watching her with hollow eyes. For 20 long years, she had been its keeper, its prisoner. For 20 years, she had carried its weight, a burden that had slowly eroded her spirit, and now, it seemed, her very life force. It was a poison she had willingly swallowed every single day, a lie she had lived with a smile. And she had done it all for one reason. She had done it for him, her husband, Captain Treverton. The thought of him was both her greatest comfort and her sharpest pain. As the wind howled outside, her mind, a traitor to her own peace, conjured his image with perfect, heartbreaking clarity. She saw him not as he was now, his face etched with worry as he watched over her, but as she first knew him, a man carved from the sea and the sky, with eyes the color of a calm ocean and a laugh that could chase away the deepest gloom. She remembered the feeling of his strong, calloused hands holding hers, the scent of salt and wind that always clung to him when he returned from a voyage. He was her anchor, her safe harbor in a world that had always felt treacherous. Her love for him was a vast and terrifying thing, as wild and untamed as the sea itself. It was a love that had demanded the ultimate sacrifice, the sacrifice of truth. And now, in these final, fading hours, that same love was demanding the opposite. It was screaming at her to confess. A memory, sharp and vivid, cut through the fog of her illness. It was from a summer evening years ago. The storm had been a distant rumble then, not the monster clawing at the windows. They had been walking along the cliff path, the setting sun painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. He had stopped, turned to her, and taken her face in his hands. His expression was one of absolute, unclouded adoration. "Rosamond," he had said, his voice thick with emotion, "I sometimes feel I am the luckiest man alive, to have a wife so good, so honest. I know I can trust you with my life, with my very soul." He had sealed those words with a kiss she now remembered as a brand of guilt upon her lips. So good, so honest. The words echoed in the sepulchral silence of the room, a cruel mockery of the life she had built. Every tender touch, every shared smile, every whispered confidence they had ever exchanged was built upon the foundation of that one terrible lie. She had taken his trust, a thing so pure and freely given, and she had betrayed it every single day. He thought he was married to a woman of virtue, but he was married to a fraud, a living deception. The love she felt for him was so profound that the thought of him discovering the truth after she was gone was an agony worse than death itself. But the thought of him living on, unknowingly building his future on a lie, loving the memory of a woman who never truly existed, that was a torment she could not bear. Felt like the ultimate betrayal. He deserved the truth. He deserved to be free of the lie, even if it shattered his heart. Her love for him was no longer about protecting him from pain, but about honoring him with the truth, no matter the cost. It was a war that had raged within her for 2 decades, a silent, bloody battle fought in the chambers of her heart. On one side was the promise she had made long ago, a solemn vow to a dying woman to carry the secret to her own grave. On the other was her desperate, all-consuming love for her husband. For 20 years the promise had won. Fear and duty had kept her silent. But now, with death's shadow lengthening across the floor, the balance had shifted. What good was a promise to the dead when it meant betraying the living? What honor was there in silence when it corrupted the purest love she had ever known? A surge of resolve, born from a love that was more powerful than her fear of the consequences, flooded through her weakened body. It was a final, defiant act of will. She would not let the secret win. She would not pass into the darkness, leaving him in a world of illusion. She would give him the only thing of value she had left to give, the terrible, liberating truth. Her love for Captain Treverton was not a quiet, gentle thing. It was a fierce, desperate force, and it demanded a confession. Her eyes, burning with a new, feverish light, scanned the dark room. She had to tell him, now, before the last of her strength failed her, before the secret could claim its final victory and drag her, silent, into the grave. The crushing weight on Rosamond Treverton's soul did not belong to her. It was an inheritance, a cursed heirloom passed down to her in the dead of night, not in a velvet-lined box, but in a whispered command. The secret was not her creation. She was merely its guardian, its jailer, and in turn, its prisoner. Her mind, pulled from the comforting image of her husband, was dragged back against its will into another deathbed scene, one from 20 years before. It was a memory that had lost none of its chilling power, a moment frozen in time, as cold and unyielding as a gravestone. She was young then, a companion, barely more than a girl, serving the original mistress of Porthgenna Tower. That woman had been nothing like Rosamond. She was a creature of iron and granite, her heart as hard and unforgiving as the Cornish cliffs. Even in her final days, with her body failing, her will remained absolute. The memory played out in Rosamond's mind with terrifying clarity. The room had been different, but just as oppressive. The air was stale with the scent of old grudges and bitter regrets. The old mistress lay in her bed, a gaunt, skeletal figure whose eyes, even dimmed by death's approach, held a cold reptilian fire. Rosamond remembered standing by the bedside, her hands clasped nervously. The dying woman had beckoned her closer with a single bony finger. Her voice, when it came, was not the weak whisper of the dying, but a dry, rustling hiss that seemed to slither into Rosamond's ear and coil itself around her heart. "You will listen to me?" the old woman had commanded, her grip surprisingly strong as she seized Rosamond's wrist. "There are things a man must never know, things that would destroy the name of this family. The legacy of Porthgenna is built on a lie, girl. A necessary lie." Her cold, gray eyes had bored into Rosamond's, pinning her in place. Captain Treverton can never know the truth of it. He must continue to believe what he believes. He must live and die in ignorance. It is his happiness, and it is the only thing that will preserve the honor of this house. The grip on her wrist tightened, the long, yellowed nails digging into her skin. "I am dying. This burden must pass to someone. It must pass to you. You will be the new keeper of the secret." Rosamond had tried to pull away, a nameless dread making her blood run cold. But the old woman held fast. "Swear it," she hissed, her face a mask of terrible intensity. "Swear to me now. Swear on your immortal soul that you will take the secret to your own grave. That you will never, by word or by sign, reveal the truth to anyone, especially not to him. Swear that you will protect the lie. Swear it." The force of that command had been hypnotic, overwhelming. And so, in that cold, dark room, a terrified young woman had given her word. She had sworn a vow to the dead, a promise sealed not with a kiss, but with the cold touch of a dying hand. Now, 20 years later, that promise felt like a cold chain wrapped around her soul, its links forged in a dead woman's malice, its lock rusted shut by the passage of time. The ghost of that promise lived within the walls of Porthgenna Tower, and its most frequent haunt was the heart of Rosamond Treverton. This vow to the dead was the source of the terrible war that now raged within her. It was a silent, brutal conflict that had been tearing her apart for 2 decades. And in these final hours, the fighting had reached a fever pitch. Her mind became a battlefield, with 2 opposing armies clashing in a fight to the death. On one side stood the specter of the old mistress, the cold voice of the promise, a general commanding an army of fear and guilt. You swore, the voice would hiss in her thoughts, as chilling as the day she first heard it. An oath on your soul is not a trifle to be discarded. Betray the dead, and you betray God. You will be damned for eternity. What is one man's momentary peace compared to the eternal damnation of your own soul? This voice was cunning. It twisted her own piety against her. It reminded her of the sanctity of the vow, the solemn duty to honor one's word, especially a word given to someone on their deathbed. To break it would be the ultimate sacrilege. It whispered of the consequences, painting vivid pictures of a dishonored name, of a legacy destroyed, of the chaos and ruin that the truth would unleash. It told her that silence was her sacred duty. Silence was her honor. But on the other side of the battlefield was a force even more powerful. Her desperate, all-consuming love for her husband. This army was commanded by the voice of her own heart, a voice that was not a hiss, but a passionate, pleading cry. What of your vow to him? It would scream back at the ghost. The vow you made at the altar, to love, to honor, to cherish. Is this honoring him? To let him live a life wrapped in falsehood? To let him love a woman who is a walking, breathing lie? This voice used her love as its weapon. It summoned memories of his kindness, his trust, his unwavering devotion. It replayed the moment he had called her good and honest, each word a dagger turning in the wound of her deceit. His trust is the most sacred thing you have ever been given. Her heart cried out, and you have spat upon it every single day for 20 years. A love built on lies is not love. It is a cage. You must set him free, and in doing so, perhaps you can free yourself. The war was relentless. The 2 forces clashed, and the battlefield was her very being. One moment, she would shrink back in terror from the thought of breaking her vow, her soul cowering before the ghost of the old mistress. The next, a wave of love for her husband would wash over her, so fierce and so pure that it gave her the strength to face any damnation. The conflict was so violent, so real, that her body reacted to it. A sheen of cold sweat would break out on her forehead. Her breath would come in ragged, panicked gasps. She would twist in her bed, her limbs twitching, as if physically trying to escape the war inside her head. The storm outside raged in perfect sympathy with the one in her soul. A sudden, violent crash of thunder would echo the moment the voice of her promise screamed of damnation. The low, mournful howl of the wind was the sound of her own heart weeping. Finally, through the smoke and carnage of the internal battle, one thought emerged, clear and resolute. The dead are dead. They cannot feel pain. They cannot be betrayed. Her duty was not to a cold memory, to a long-dead woman of iron and hate. Her duty was to the living, breathing man whose heart was intertwined with hers. He deserved the truth, no matter how ugly, no matter how painful. The greatest act of love she could perform now was not to protect him with silence, but to arm him with the truth. The war was over. Love had won. But how? How could she deliver this final, terrible message? Her voice was a fragile thread, barely strong enough for a whisper, and it often failed her entirely, dissolving into a fit of coughing. She could not trust it to carry the weight of such a confession. To try and speak it would be to risk the words dying in her throat, the secret remaining locked away forever. And she could not bear the thought of telling him face to face, of watching his beloved features contort in pain and disbelief as she unraveled the very fabric of his life. No, she was a coward in that, she admitted to herself. A coward who loved him too much to see the wound she was about to inflict. Her feverish eyes darted around the shadowed room, searching for a solution. They fell upon the writing desk. It stood in the far corner, near the window, a dark, solid shape against the gloom. On its surface, she could just make out the faint glint of the silver inkwell and the slender form of a pen in its holder. The pen and paper. Of course, it was the only way. A letter. A letter could not be interrupted by a coughing fit. A letter could not falter or lose its nerve. It would speak the truth in cold, clear, undeniable ink. It would be her final testament, her confession, her last and truest love letter all in one. The letter would be her voice when she no longer had one. The idea took hold of her, giving her a strength she hadn't felt in weeks. The desk, which a moment before had been just a piece of furniture, was now transformed. It was the sanctuary. It was a destination. It was the place where she could finally unburden her soul and kill the secret that had been slowly killing her. The distance from her bed to that desk seemed immense. a vast, uncharted chasm she would have to cross. But she had to. The physical act of writing the confession, of forming the forbidden words with her own hand, suddenly seemed critically important. It was a ritual of exorcism. She would write the secret down, seal it, and give it to him. Then, and only then, would she be free. With her decision made, the long, arduous process of putting it into action began. The physical struggle was a new kind of battle, one fought not with thoughts and emotions, but with atrophied muscles and failing lungs. First, the blankets. They were heavy, woven things that felt as if they were weighted with lead. With a groan that was lost in the sound of the wind, she used all her meager strength to push them back. The sudden shock of the cold room air on her feverish, sweat-damp skin made her gasp and shiver violently. For a moment, the world tilted, and the shadows in the room seemed to swirl and deepen. She paused, taking a series of shallow, rattling breaths, waiting for the dizziness to pass. Then, she began the next great challenge. Swinging her legs over the side of the bed. It was a slow, clumsy movement. Her limbs felt alien, disconnected from her will. Finally, her bare feet touched the floorboards. The cold was a shock that shot up her entire body. But it was a real, grounding sensation in a world that had become a fever dream. She sat there for a long minute, her head bowed, gathering what was left of her energy, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The desk seemed a mile away. Using the bedside table for support, she pulled herself to her feet. The room spun violently. The floor seemed to pitch and roll beneath her like the deck of a ship in a storm. She squeezed her eyes shut, her knuckles white as she gripped the polished wood of the table. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest. Her breath came in a raw, ragged rasp. It was the sound of a body pushed far beyond its limits. But the image of her husband's face, the desperate need to give him the truth, propelled her forward. She took her first step, then another. Each one was a monumental effort of will. She shuffled across the floor, her thin nightdress offering no protection from the chill. She kept one hand trailing along the wall, her fingers tracing the cold texture of the wallpaper, using it to guide her and keep her balance. The grand, dark furniture she had to navigate loomed over her like ancient monoliths. The shadows they cast were long and distorted in the faint moonlight that managed to pierce the curtains, and they seemed to morph and twist, playing tricks on her fevered mind. For a terrifying second, the shadow of a tall wardrobe looked like the silhouette of the old mistress, standing with her arms crossed, watching, judging. Rosamond whimpered, a small, frightened sound, but she did not stop. She was a pilgrim on a final, desperate journey. The inkwell on the desk was her holy grail. She could hear the blood pounding in her ears, a frantic rhythm that kept time with the crashing of the waves outside. Louder and louder, closer and closer. Finally, her outstretched hand touched the cold, smooth wood of the desk. She slumped against it, a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees. She had made it. She stood there, panting, her body trembling with exhaustion. But she was not finished. The final act remained. Slowly, painfully, she pulled out the heavy chair and sank into it. She stared at the clean, white sheet of paper that lay waiting in the center of the desk. It looked so pure, so innocent. Soon, it would be stained with the ugliest secret imaginable. Her gaze lifted to the pen, resting in its silver holder. It was her weapon, her key, her salvation. With a hand that shook so badly she could barely control it, a hand that was now as pale and bony as the one that had cursed her all those years ago, she reached out. Her trembling fingers brushed against the cold, smooth surface of the pen. The moment of truth was here. Now, having crossed the vast, empty expanse of the room, Rosamond sat slumped at the desk. Her body was a trembling, exhausted vessel, but her will was a shard of iron. The pen was within reach. The paper lay before her like a clean slate, an invitation to unburden a lifetime of lies. But as she sat there, poised on the brink of confession, the room itself began to assert its presence, its atmosphere shifting from one of solemnity to one of active menace. The first thing to intrude upon her resolve was the sound, the eternal, inescapable sound of the sea. It was not the gentle, rhythmic shushing one might imagine from a coastal home. This was a sound of pure, elemental violence. Porthgenna Tower was built so close to the cliff's edge that it felt as though the very foundations were plunged into the churning water below. Tonight, with the storm at its peak, the sound was a physical force. It was a low, guttural roar that vibrated up through the stone floor, through the legs of the desk, and into Rosamond's very bones. It was the sound of a great beast endlessly clawing at the walls of its cage. This constant, deep-throated growl was punctuated by sudden, explosive crashes as tons of water, freighted with the power of the entire Atlantic, hurled themselves against the unyielding rock. Each impact was a cannon blast that seemed to shake the tower to its core, making the old timbers groan in protest. The sound was a thief. It stole the silence. It drowned out the tick of the mantel clock, the frantic beat of her own heart, and even the shallow, rasping sound of her breathing. It was an all-consuming symphony of chaos that served as a constant, brutal reminder of her isolation. The sea wasn't just outside. It felt like it was inside, mirroring the tempest in her soul. Every crashing wave was a blow from her conscience. Every mournful howl of the wind through the turrets was the cry of the ghost she was about to betray. The sound was not a backdrop to her struggle. It was an active participant, a hostile entity that seemed determined to wear down her resolve, to remind her that here, in this place, nature was king, and human secrets were fragile, foolish things that could be smashed to pieces just like a ship on the rocks. It was the angry voice of the world she had hidden from, and it was screaming at her through the walls. As the roar of the sea laid siege to the tower from without, the room itself conspired to imprison her from within. It was a vast, cavernous space, designed for grandeur, but time and sorrow had transformed it into a crypt. The high, vaulted ceiling was lost in a thick, impenetrable darkness, making it feel as if she were sitting at the bottom of a well. The heavy, dark furniture she had navigated on her perilous journey from the bed now stood like a silent congregation of judges. The hulking wardrobe, the stern-looking chests of drawers, the tall, slender grandfather clock in the corner, whose voice had been silenced by the storm, they were not inanimate objects. In the flickering, uncertain light, they were witnesses. Their polished surfaces held dark, distorted reflections, and their immense, blocky shadows stretched and writhed on the walls and floor, like living things that stirred and shifted with every distant flash of lightning. The air in the room was stale and heavy, choked with the dust of years and the unspoken words of a generation. It was the air of a place where too much has happened, and none of it good. It felt thick in her lungs, difficult to breathe, as if the very atmosphere were saturated with the weight of the secret she was about to commit to paper. This room had been the original mistress's death chamber, the very place where the vow had been extracted from her. Rosamond could almost feel the lingering chill of that moment, the residue of that iron will, still clinging to the velvet curtains and embedded in the dark wood grain of the furniture. The room was not just a container for her fear. It was the source of it. It was a tomb, and she was trapped inside with the ghost of the past. She felt a rising tide of claustrophobia, a desperate sense that the walls were slowly, imperceptibly closing in, that the ceiling was lowering, and that the shadows were gathering to suffocate her before she could ever get the words out. Her gaze, desperate for some connection to the outside world, some escape from the oppressive gloom, was inevitably drawn to the window. It was a tall, arched casement window, set deep into the thick stone wall. It was her only link to the storm, to the night, to the world beyond the suffocating confines of Porthgenna Tower. But tonight, the window offered no comfort. It was not a portal to freedom, but a screen for her deepest fears. The glass was old, warped and imperfect, and the furious rain lashed against it in diagonal, silver streaks that were briefly illuminated by the lightning. Beyond the glass, there was nothing to see but a churning, absolute blackness of void where the sky and the sea had merged into one indistinguishable mass of violent darkness. The window became a dark mirror. As she stared into it, waiting for her trembling hand to steady, she saw a reflection. It was not the familiar image of herself, but a ghostly caricature. The faint, wavering light from the single candle on her desk threw her features into sharp, skeletal relief. She saw a pale, haunted face with eyes that were too dark, hollowed-out pits of terror. Her hair, matted with feverish sweat, clung to a skull-like head. The reflection was of an apparition, a specter, a woman who was already half gone from the world. It was a horrifying vision of what she was becoming, a ghost haunting her own deathbed. She was staring at her own damnation, reflected back at her from the barrier that separated her from the living world. The window was no longer just glass and wood. It was a frontier between the known and the unknown, between the dying and the dead, and it felt terribly, terrifyingly thin. And then it began. It was not a sound or a sight, but a change in the quality of the atmosphere. It was a feeling, a deep primal instinct that screamed a single word: danger. It started as a subtle prickling on the back of her neck, the kind of sensation that makes the fine hairs stand on end. Then came a chill, a profound coldness that bloomed in the center of her chest and spread its icy tendrils through her veins. This was not the chill of the drafty room or the cold of her fever. This was an ancient, unnatural cold. It was the cold of the grave. The feeling intensified, sharpening into a distinct, terrifying certainty. She was being watched. Her breath hitched in her throat. Her body went rigid in the chair. Every nerve ending screamed. She tried to reason with herself. It was the fever playing tricks on her mind. It was the storm, the shadows, the oppressive history of the house working on her overwrought imagination. But the feeling was too real, too insistent to be dismissed. It was a palpable presence in the room with her, a silent, unseen observer. Her eyes, wide with a fresh wave of terror, darted frantically around the room, searching the deep pools of shadow in the corners, scanning the looming shapes of the furniture. She saw nothing but the familiar gloom. She heard nothing but the roar of the sea and the howl of the wind. But she felt it. It was a cold, malevolent attention, focused entirely on her. It was the kind of focused stare that you can feel on your back, even in a crowded room. But here, in this isolated chamber, the feeling was 1,000 times more potent. It was intimate and violating. Her frantic gaze swept the room one more time, and then, as if pulled by an invisible string, her eyes locked back onto the window. The feeling was coming from there, from the blackness beyond the rain-streaked glass. She could not look away. The window, which moments before had been a dark mirror, now felt like an eye. A great, black, unblinking eye that was staring into the room, staring directly at her. The roaring of the sea seemed to fade into a distant hum. The howling of the wind quieted. Her entire universe shrank to the space between her and that tall, dark rectangle of glass. She stared, her heart hammering against her ribs, her mind screaming for her to look away, to run, to hide. But she was frozen, transfixed by a terror so profound it paralyzed her. She felt like a small, terrified animal caught in the gaze of a predator. The air grew thick and heavy, and a silent, terrible question formed in her mind. A question that was an answer in itself. Was she truly alone? Or had the ghost of her promise come to watch her break it? Her nervous glances had ceased. Now, she could only stare, waiting for the suffocating darkness in the window to finally show her what was looking back. The feeling of being watched intensified. It was no longer a vague premonition but a sharp, undeniable fact of her reality. The window had become the focal point of all the malice in the world, a dark stage upon which some terrible drama was about to unfold. Every instinct in Rosamond's screaming, terrified mind told her to flee, to stumble back to the relative safety of her bed and pull the covers over her head like a child hiding from a nightmare. But then, another feeling rose to meet the terror, a hot, defiant wave of love for her husband. This love, which had driven her from her sickbed, was now the only armor she possessed against the encroaching dread. No, a voice in her head whispered, a voice that was her own, yet stronger than she had ever known it to be. I have come this far. I will not be turned back by shadows. This was her final battle. A battle against the ghost of a promise, against the cold judgment of the past, and against whatever malevolent presence now stared at her from the heart of the storm. To surrender now would be the ultimate failure. It would mean condemning her husband to a life of lies and her own soul to an eternity of regret. A strange, feverish clarity descended upon her. She was going to die in this room, in this tower. That was a certainty. But she would not die a coward. She would not die the keeper of a dead woman's poison. She would die as Rosamond Treverton, the wife of the captain, and her last act on this earth would be one of truth. With a deep, shuddering breath that felt like she was inhaling splinters of ice, she broke her gaze from the terrifying blackness of the window. She forced her eyes down to the desk, to the clean white paper and the waiting pen. Her hand, which had been frozen in mid-air, resumed its journey. It trembled so violently that the movement was jerky, spastic like a puppet on a string. But it moved forward. Her fingertips, cold as stone, finally made contact with the slender, silver body of the pen. The metal was shockingly cold, a jolt of Arctic reality that seemed to momentarily steady her. She wrapped her weak fingers around it. The pen felt unnaturally heavy, as if it were not filled with ink, but with all the sorrow and deceit she was about to pour onto the page. She lifted it. The nib hovered over the paper, a tiny, sharp point of darkness suspended over a field of white. This was the moment of defiance. This was the point of no return. The roar of the sea, the howl of the wind, the oppressive weight of the room, it all seemed to fade into a dull, distant hum. All that existed was her will, the pen, and the empty page. She lowered her hand. The delicate tip of the nib touched the paper. The sound it made was infinitesimal, a tiny, dry scratch. In the thunderous chaos of the storm, it should have been completely inaudible. But to Rosamond, it was as loud as a scream. It was the sound of a vow being broken. The sound of a lock, rusted shut for 20 years, finally being forced open. It was the sound of her rebellion. She began to form the first letter of the first word, the first crack in the dam of silence. And it was at that exact, catastrophic moment that the night outside the window answered. It began subtly, a flicker, a distortion on the surface of the rain-streaked glass. Her eyes, still locked on the page, registered it peripherally. She thought at first it was just a trick of the candlelight, or perhaps a particularly strange pattern of rain sliding down the pane. She tried to ignore it, to focus on the words she was writing, but the disturbance at the edge of her vision was persistent. It was a smudge of deeper blackness against the already absolute dark, a patch of void that seemed to suck the faint candlelight into it. A sudden, brilliant fork of lightning split the sky, illuminating the entire coastline for one horrifying, stark white second. In that silent, bleached instant, Rosamond's head snapped up, and she saw it. It wasn't a smudge. It wasn't a trick of the light. For the briefest fraction of a second, framed against the raging sea, there was a definite shape standing outside the window. A human shape. Then, just as quickly, the world was plunged back into darkness, leaving the searing afterimage burned onto her retinas. A strangled gasp escaped her lips. Impossible. The word was a silent scream in her mind. This room was on the upper floor of the tower. Below this window was nothing but a sheer drop of 100 feet, down to a narrow, treacherous ledge of rock that was currently being devoured by the storm-tossed sea. There was nowhere to stand. There was nothing to hold on to. It was a physical, logical, absolute impossibility. It had to have been her imagination, the fever, the stress, a hallucination born of guilt and a dying mind. She tried to cling to that rational explanation, to anchor herself to it as the waves of terror threatened to pull her under. But the feeling of being watched was now overwhelming, a crushing physical pressure. And the smudge of darkness was still there. It wasn't fading. It was growing. Slowly, horribly, the patch of deeper black began to condense. It was like watching smoke gather and take form, or like watching ink bleed into water in slow motion. The edges sharpened, pulling in the surrounding darkness until it resolved itself into a clear, unmistakable silhouette. It was a figure, standing motionless outside her window, seemingly untouched by the gale-force winds and the lashing rain. It was the silhouette of a person. The silhouette of a woman. Rosamond's mind simply refused to process what her eyes were seeing. She could make out the shape of a head, the line of the shoulders, the long, dark fall of what might have been a cloak or a dress that melted into the darkness below. The figure was unnaturally still, a point of perfect calm in the midst of utter chaos. The wind that was powerful enough to shake the stone tower did not stir its clothing. The rain that hammered against the glass seemed to pass right through it. It was a hole in the reality of the storm, a specter made of shadow and impossibility. And it was watching her. And then the figure moved. The motion was not human. It was slow, deliberate, and unnervingly smooth. A single arm, a long, dark shape of shadow, began to lift from its side. It rose with a dreadful, inexorable grace, not the motion of muscle and bone, but the flow of something ancient and unstoppable. It rose higher and higher, until the hand was level with the fascia face that remained a featureless, terrifying void of black. The hand, a thing of shadow and rain, turned. The palm faced forward, flat and open, a clear, silent, and utterly commanding gesture. It was a gesture that transcended language, a universal signal that struck a chord of pure, primal fear deep in Rosamond's soul. The meaning was as clear as if it had been shouted in her ear. Stop! The silent command slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. It was not a request. It was an order from a power she could not comprehend, an absolute veto on her defiance. This was the guardian of the secret. This was the ghost of the promise she had made. It had come from whatever dark place it inhabited to enforce the vow she was about to break. The specter did not need to speak. It did not need to threaten. Its very presence, its impossible existence, was threat enough. Its silent gesture held all the cold, unyielding power of the grave. It was the dead, reaching out from beyond the veil to hold her to her word. Time seemed to stop. The roaring of the sea became a distant whisper. The air in Rosamond's lungs turned to ice. A scream built in her throat, a high, piercing shriek of utter, mind-shattering terror, but it could find no escape. It was trapped, suffocating her from the inside out. Her connection to her own body was severed. She could feel her heart hammering, a frantic, trapped thing, but she could not command her limbs to move. She was a statue carved from fear. Her eyes were locked on the shadowy hand, on the silent, absolute command. And then she felt a tremor that began in her fingertips. Her hand, the hand that held the pen, began to spasm uncontrollably. Her fingers, which had been locked in a grip of iron resolve, suddenly went limp and useless. The pen slipped. It fell from her nerveless grasp, tumbling through the air in a slow, silent arc. It struck the desk with a faint clatter that sounded like a breaking bone in the sudden, profound silence of her mind. It bounced once, then rolled, coming to rest on the white sheet of paper. A single, perfect drop of black ink welled up from the nib. It hung there for a moment, glistening like a dark jewel in the candlelight, before it finally let go. It fell onto the page, spreading instantly, creating a dark, ugly blot on the pristine white surface. It was not a word. It was not a confession. It was a stain, a wound, a single, black tear for the truth that would now never be told. Rosamond did not see the ink spill. She saw nothing but the window. Her mouth was agape, her body rigid. Her mind wiped clean of everything but the image of the shadow against the glass. She was frozen in a state of absolute horror, a prisoner in her own body, held captive by the silent, impossible figure that stood vigil in the heart of the storm, guarding the dead secret with all the authority of the night itself. The tableau held for an eternity. Rosamond remained frozen at the desk, a statue of pure terror, her eyes locked on the impossible figure at the window. The shadow woman stood her ground, her hand raised in that silent, absolute command, a specter of judgment framed against the raging storm. The world had shrunk to this single, horrifying standoff, the dying woman and the guardian of her secret. The air in the room was thick and cold, so heavy it felt difficult to breathe. The single candle on the desk flickered violently, its small flame bowing and dancing as if in the presence of an unseen wind, casting Rosamond's wide, terrified eyes into stark relief and making the shadows in the room writhe and pulse like living things. Then, as inexplicably as it had appeared, the figure began to fade. It was not a sudden disappearance, not a blink-and-you'll-miss-it vanishing act. The process was slow, ethereal, and profoundly unnerving. The sharp edges of the silhouette began to soften, the deep, impenetrable blackness of its form becoming less absolute. It was as if the figure were dissolving, its substance thinning out, becoming translucent. The hard lines of its shoulders and head blurred, bleeding back into the churning chaos of the storm behind it. The hand, that terrible hand that had held her paralyzed, lost its definition, its fingers melting away one by one into streaks of rain and darkness. Rosamond watched, her mind still numb with shock, as the apparition slowly unraveled. It seemed to be reabsorbed by the very night from which it had been born. The last part of it to go was the space where its head had been, a patch of deeper void that lingered for a moment longer before it too dissipated, like smoke caught in a gale. In a matter of seconds, it was gone. Completely. The window was once again just a window, a dark, rain-streaked pane of glass showing nothing but the violent, empty blackness of the storm. It had left no trace, no mark on the glass, no disturbance in the rain, no lingering cold spot. It was as if it had never been there at all. The release from its gaze was as sudden and as violent as its appearance. The tension that had held Rosamond's body rigid snapped. A long, shuddering tremor ran through her from head to toe. The breath she had been holding for what felt like an eternity came rushing out of her in a raw, ragged sob. The sound was thin and weak in the cavernous room, quickly swallowed by the unabated roar of the sea. The strength that had carried her across the room, the defiant will that had driven her to the desk, vanished completely, drained away by the sheer force of her terror. Her body, already pushed far beyond its limits, finally surrendered. She slumped forward in the chair, her head hitting the hard surface of the desk with a dull thud. The last thing she saw before the world dissolved into a merciful blackness was the single, ugly blot of ink on the pristine white page, the black tear of her defeat. The secret was safe. The ghost had won. She awoke sometime later, though whether it had been minutes or hours, she could not say. The first thing she was aware of was the cold. It was a deep, penetrating cold that had settled into her bones. She was still slumped over the desk, her cheek pressed against the polished wood. With a groan of profound agony, she forced herself to lift her head. Every muscle screamed in protest. The room was just as it had been. The storm still raged with unabated fury. The single candle had burned down low, its flame sputtering in a pool of melted wax, threatening to plunge the room into complete darkness at any moment. Her mind was a confused fog of fever and fear. Had it been real? The question hammered at her. Had a specter truly manifested outside her window? A ghostly sentinel sent from beyond the grave to enforce a 20-year-old promise? The image was seared into her memory with the clarity of a lightning strike. The impossible silhouette, the raised hand, the silent command. It felt more real than the desk beneath her hands, more real than the pain in her own body. A supernatural hand had reached out and stopped her. The dead had intervened to protect their lie. But then, another voice, a weaker, more rational part of her mind, began to whisper its doubts. She was a dying woman. Her body was racked with a relentless fever. Her mind, starved of rest and tormented by a guilt that had festered for 2 decades, was hardly a reliable witness. What if there had been no figure? What if the shadow was nothing more than a hallucination, a waking nightmare born from her own conflicted soul? Perhaps her own deep-seated fear of breaking the vow, her own terror of the consequences, had become so powerful that it had projected itself onto the canvas of the storm. Perhaps the guardian of the secret was not some external ghost, but a monster she had created within herself. The specter at the window might have been nothing more than the physical manifestation of her own guilt. She looked from the now empty window to the ink-stained paper on the desk. The evidence was ambiguous. The pen lay where it had fallen. The black blot marred the page, a silent testament to her failure. Did it prove she had been stopped by a ghost? Or did it simply prove that her own hand, shaking with fear and illness, had failed her at the crucial moment? Both possibilities were equally terrifying. To be haunted by the vengeful dead was a horrifying thought. But to be so consumed by one's own guilt that the mind fractures and creates its own monsters, that was a different, more intimate kind of horror. One meant the past had power over the present. The other meant she was her own jailer, her own ghost. She would never know the answer. The truth of that moment had vanished with the shadow, lost to the wind and the waves. The question would remain, hanging in the air of this room long after she was gone. It was a mystery that would never be solved. A final, cruel twist in the story of her life. Was the house haunted? Or was she? In the end, did it even matter? The result was the same. The letter remained unwritten. The truth remained unspoken. The secret was still locked safely, or perhaps damnably, within her. With the last of her energy, she pushed herself away from the desk. The journey back to the bed was a slow, stumbling nightmare. She didn't have the strength to walk, so she crawled. Her hands and knees scraped against the cold, rough floorboards. The journey that had been a pilgrimage of defiance was now a retreat of utter defeat. Every inch was a torment, a reminder of her failure. By the time she reached the bed, she was sobbing, not from fear, but from a grief so profound it felt like it was tearing her soul apart. She had failed him. She had tried to give him the truth, but the past, whether real or imagined, was simply too strong. She managed to pull herself up onto the edge of the mattress, her body shaking with a combination of cold, exhaustion, and despair. She fell back against the pillows, pulling the heavy blankets up to her chin, seeking a warmth that would never come. She lay there, listening to the storm, her eyes wide open in the near darkness. She did not look toward the window again. She did not dare to. The battle was over. She had lost. All that was left was to wait for the end, to carry the secret with her into the final silence, just as she had sworn to do all those years ago. The weight on her soul was heavier than ever before, because now it was mingled with the bitter weight of her failure. The love that had given her the strength to fight was now the source of her deepest pain, a constant reminder of the freedom she had failed to give her husband. The unspoken mystery of the shadow was now her eternal companion, a question that would follow her into the grave, and perhaps beyond. The final page is turned, but the chill will linger long after the screen goes dark. Subscribe and return for the next secret we unearth. The letter remains unwritten. The secret is safe, for now, protected by a dying woman's fear and a mysterious shadow. We are left with only questions, lost in the wind and the waves of the Cornish coast. What do you think the shadow was? And what terrible secret could be worth all this torment? Tell me your theories in the comments below.